Present value of growth opportunities. Let's look at an illustration. Suppose that today is January 1st, 2019, and under a no growth scenario, the earnings per share for the entire year would be $5 if there was no growth. However, long-term projections are as follows. The company's retention rate is going to be 80%. In other words, they're going to retain 80% of their earnings and therefore only pay out 20% of earnings as dividends. The return on equity is expected to be 15%, and the required rate of return is 14%. So the first thing we want to do is we want to calculate the sustainable growth rate. So what rate would this company be growing? I know they're returning 15%, but does that mean that they're going to grow at 15%? Not necessarily, because we know part of the 15% is going to be paid out in the form of dividends. So that part is not going to contribute to the company's growth, because dividend means that the cash flow is leaving the company. So what we want to do is we want to look at which part of the 15% is reinvested back into the company. And here's where our analysis picks up. So the net growth is equal to the gross return 1 minus leak. And what that says here is that the portion of the gross that is left, that's the one that contributes to growth. So the total growth rate is represented by ROE, but then after we factor out the portion that's being paid out, whatever remains contributes to that internal growth or sustainable growth. So let's plug in the numbers. ROE is 15, but 20% of that is being leaked out. So only 80% of that 15 is being reinvested, and that works out to 12% growth internally. The next thing we want to do is we want to estimate D1, and the framework we use for that is as follows. Because we're starting with E0, so that's earnings today. To get to D1, first we need to calculate E1, and then from E1 we can calculate D1. So what's the link between all these? To go from E0 to E1, you just compound it by the growth rate for one period, and that gives you E1. Now to go from E1 to D1, we just multiply the E1 by the payout ratio. So the part of the earnings that's paid out is dividends, and then altogether that gives you D1. So now it's just a matter of plugging in all the values, and then we get a value of $1.12 for D1. Now in part 3, let's calculate the intrinsic value for the stock, and we're using the constant growth model here, and we have all the inputs. We have D1, we have the required rate of return, and we have the growth rate, which we computed in part 1, and then that gives us a total value of $56. Now what we want to do is we want to calculate the portion of this $56 that represents base valuation. And what I mean by base valuation is, what would be the value of this company if there was no growth? Do you see the difference, ladies and gentlemen? This 56 incorporates growth. But part 4 says, well, what would the value have been had there been no growth? Well, okay. So you could see I'm using the exact same framework, but now the G is 0. And at the same time, because there's no growth, what would be the implicit assumption? Why isn't the company growing? I thought it was making an ROE, return of equity, 15%. Why wouldn't it be growing? Well, if you, under the no growth scenario, we assume that entire 15% return is paid out in the form of dividends. So the other implicit assumption under no growth is that your entire earnings is being paid out as dividends. So with that revelation, look how we modify this constant growth model. Again, we use a ground up philosophy. So this is our constant growth model. That's our starting point. And then we say, okay, how do we adjust this under the no growth scenario? Well, first of all, the G disappears because there's no growth. But at the same time, we said that where you see dividends, that would equal to earnings. So instead of D1, we use E1. And E1 would be the $5. Again, you got to be careful here. We're doing it under the no growth scenario. So if there was no growth, E1 would be, so for example, see this analysis we did? If there was no growth, this would be 0. So therefore, E1 would just be the same as E0. And there it is. That's your no growth framework. Now it's just a matter of plugging in the numbers. Well, under no growth, we're told that earnings would just be 5, and just discounted by the required rate of return, we would get a no growth value of 35.71. So now in part 5, we are ready to calculate present value of growth opportunities. And that is just the difference between the total value of the firm, which includes growth, and the value of the firm without growth. So of course the difference would be growth, or due to growth, I should say. And there it is. So $56 is the total, and then you subtract the portion that represents base valuation without any growth. So therefore the difference is the part of the valuation that's attributed to growth, and that works out to 2029. So now we're going to do a summary of all these calculations. So here's the total value, 56, and we're just breaking it down into 2 parts. It's base value or current operations. That's worth 35.71, which represents 64% of the valuation. And the remaining part of the valuation must be attributed to the company's future growth opportunities, and that's worth 2029, and that represents 36% of the company's valuation. And this is kind of interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because rather than looking at the whole price and saying, is this a fair price? Now the analyst can say, you know what? We should only be looking at this, and we should be asking ourselves, is 2029 a fair value for the company's future growth opportunities? Because the 35.71, that's how much it would be worth if the status quo was maintained. So we're just interested in the future prospects of this firm, and that's represented by Pvgo. Now, alternatively, we can express Pvgo as a multiple, and again, using our ground-up philosophy, it's right there. Total value is broken down into the base valuation plus the growth part. And if we're using the absolute approach, so here's the total price, here's how we found the value for no growth scenario, and there's your growth part, but that's, again, that's using absolute. In other words, just total valuation, or just in dollars, if you will. But then in multiple, all we do is we just divide everything by EPS. That's what a multiple is. So here's our multiple, the PE ratio. But then you got to divide all these variables by E. So if you divide this by E, the E's cancel out. So you're left with 1 over R. And of course over here, it would just be Pvgo over E. And it's just an alternative way of presenting this information. It is not going to change the outlook for the stock, whether you're using absolute or multiple approach.